In this video, I'll show you everything you need to know about tattooing on real skin. This is exactly the kind of video I wish I had when I first started. And today, you're getting it completely for free. I've been tattooing for over 10 years, and I run my own studio. Now I want to share my experience with you and give you a real look at what it's like to tattoo on actual skin. I spray the work surface generously with surface disinfectant to clean it. Next, I cover the entire table with foil. On top of that, I place a disposable towel that's specifically designed for tattooing. Using a wooden spatula, I apply a bit of Vaseline to my workspace. To prevent the ink caps from tipping over, I stick them down with Vaseline. I diluted the green soap at a ratio of 1:10, and then I wrap the bottle in foil. I also wrap the tattoo machine, especially the front part of the machine needs to be fully covered. As you can see here, the machine can still be adjusted perfectly. I use dynamic inks. One pure black and the Greywash 80. Shake the ink well before use. I never dilute pure black, so we fill that ink cap completely. Greywash is specifically designed to be diluted. With this gray, we can mix different shades of gray. I fill the darkest shade with 2/3 Greywash. The next ink cap gets 1/3, and the last only a single drop. We fill the rest with shading solution. For white, I use Triple White by Dynamic. What I love about this ink is how fluid it is, which is very rare for white ink. To keep my cup of distilled water from tipping over easily, I cut a second cup in half and place the first one inside it. That way, it's more stable. If you want to switch from a dark gray or black to a lighter shade, you need to rinse the needle first. I do this by holding the cartridge in distilled water while the machine is running. Then I clean the rest off with a dry piece of paper towel while the machine is turned off. On real skin, I use stencil stuff, and for fake skin, I use speed stick. Never use speed stick on real skin. For complex tattoos, I use synthetic skin from real skin. It's super elastic and absorbs the ink really well. All the products I use can be found in the video description, and with the code fanitattoo, you save 10%. There are various types and sizes of tattoo needles available on the market, making it challenging to keep track. But don't worry, today I'll guide you through the different needle types and explain their uses, and you'll see it's not as complicated as it may seem. Choosing the right needle gauge. The gauge of the needle plays a crucial role in the type of work you want to perform. This is the first number on the needle packaging and indicates how thick the needle is at its thickest point. The most common numbers are 8 means the needle is 0.25 millimeters thick at its thickest point, ideal for detailed work, but very delicate. 10 means the needle is 0.3 millimeters thick at its thickest point. I believe you've understood the principle. The next number on the package determines the number of needles. The number of needles influences the thickness of the line. More needles mean a thicker line. With shader needles, more needles also mean thicker shading, which is logical. The letters after the numbers describe the needle type. In the world of tattoos, there are various needle types used for different purposes, from round liners to Magnum shaders. Each needle has its own function and application. RL stands for round liner needles. Perfect for clear and clean line work. RS stands for round shader needles, ideal for filling colors and basic shading and thick lines. Round shaders are very similar to liner needles, but there is one major difference. The round shader needles are straight and are further apart. The circular arrangement of the needles creates a cavity. The M1 abbreviation stands for Magnum needles. Here's a mistake you should avoid when working with a Magnum needle that isn't rounded on the sides like a soft edge needle. It can strain the skin too much when filling large areas. I don't know anyone who uses this needle because it's simply too aggressive on the skin. Additionally, there are no smooth transitions at overlapping points. RM or CM stands for Curved Magnum Shader Needles, offer better ink distribution and smoother shading. I use this needle very often, and it's perfect for soft, clean shading. There are more needle types, but I don't want to confuse or overwhelm you, so I'll leave out those types because in practice, they're not commonly used, or let's say I don't use them. Now, let's talk about the last designation on the needle package, the letters at the very end. In technical terms, the needle tips are called tapers. These abbreviations simply denote the length and characteristics of the needle tip. MT stands for medium taper, representing a medium length tip suitable for thicker outlines and filling color areas. LT stands for long taper, which is a very long tip, an all-rounder, ideal for outlines and shading. XTL is an extreme long taper, even longer than LT, mainly intended for outlines. BP means bug pin, the finest taper type for extremely fine lines. With long taper needles, for example, you can tattoo on a spot for longer without damaging the skin too much, as the angle is very sharp. This is good for line work. On the other hand, a shorter tip transports more ink into the skin, but irritates the skin more. This is good for color packing with Magnums. Of course, all of this also depends on the machine settings and speed. Usually, manufacturers already use the optimal taper for the corresponding tattoo needle, so don't worry about that. However, it's important to know what taper stands for and to have heard about it. Hand speed and voltage are two of the most important fundamentals in tattooing. If you understand the balance between these two aspects, you can draw better lines, perfect your shading, and simultaneously protect your client's skin. In this video, I'll explain what hand speed and voltage mean, how they work together, and the techniques you can use to achieve optimal results. Hand speed refers to how fast or slow you move the machine over the skin. Voltage describes the voltage of your machine, which determines how fast the needle moves. A higher voltage means the needle moves faster and therefore penetrates the skin more aggressively. A lower voltage ensures the needle works more gently and penetrates the skin more slowly. It's essential that hand speed and voltage always work in harmony. A fast hand with low voltage will lead to weak lines, while a slow hand with high voltage can damage the skin. Method 1. Adjust voltage to match the needle size. What I mean by this is that, for example, if you are drawing a line with a 7-round liner at this speed, you can do the same with a 3-round liner. You just need to reduce the voltage. The message behind this is, the thinner the needle, the lower the voltage should be in order to maintain a consistent hand speed. I hope you know what I mean by this. In this case, the hand speed stays the same because I reduced the voltage from 8 to 5 volts with the thinner needle. Method 2. Adjust hand speed to match the needle size. What I mean by this is that I use needles of different thicknesses, but do not change the voltage. Instead, I simply adjust my hand speed. I use 8 volts for every line. With the thinner needle, I have to draw the line faster because it is more aggressive toward the skin and penetrates the skin more easily. With the thicker needle, it takes longer for the ink to penetrate the skin, so I draw the line slower. Shading. In my opinion, higher voltage, for example 8 volts or higher, leads to softer and smoother shading because the needle penetrates the skin faster, allowing the pigment to distribute more evenly. This enables you to create smooth transitions. For my hand speed, 8 volts work the best. First, I print the design in the desired size. This paper comprises 4 layers, but we don't need these 2 layers. I've experimented with various thermal printers, but this one is the best, in my opinion, despite being the most affordable. If you want to purchase the same one, you'll find the link in the video description along with all the other products. I absolutely love this device. It has saved me so much work. Now, I'll open the printer, load the paper as shown here. Adjust the template and insert it into the printer. Press the blue button and the rest will take care of itself. It should look like this. First, I apply cleansing foam to the area where the tattoo will be placed. Then, shave the area thoroughly and wipe away the excess foam. It's important to always use cleansing foam when shaving because dry shaving can cause skin injuries. Now, I clean the skin with a skin disinfectant. Hygiene is incredibly important, so be very diligent here. When it comes to disinfectant, it's better to use a little too much than too little. After disinfecting, I apply a thin layer of stencil stuff and spread it evenly. Here, you need to be mindful that if too much stencil stuff is applied, the stencil might smudge. You can see how much time I take to position the stencil. I press it onto the skin very carefully. If this step isn't done precisely, you'll have to wipe off the entire stencil and redo it, which takes an incredible amount of time and is very frustrating. To make the stencil fit the body better, I make a small cut in the stencil paper with scissors, as shown here, and press it down firmly. Now, carefully peel it off and let it dry for 10 minutes. I'll show you with a macro lens visually how deep I penetrate the skin while tattooing and the mistakes one should avoid. Additionally, I'll demonstrate in which layer of the skin the ink should be placed and what to watch out for with different skin types. If you don't go deep enough, the color will only reach the top layer of the skin, the epidermis. Conversely, if you go too deep, the color reaches the lowest layer of the skin, the subcutis, leading to a blowout. The needles should penetrate the top layer of the skin and then push the ink into the so-called dermis. The most important thing, in my opinion, is to properly stretch the skin. With my free hand, I create a slight stretch, then I place the hand I work with on the thumb of the free hand. And when I actually pull the line, I support the thumb here to get stability. To make the hand glide over the skin, I apply some Vaseline beforehand. Just try it, you will see it makes a big difference. Finding the right depth is very difficult for many of you. Many are afraid to go too deep or not deep enough. Here, I have to say clearly, it is better to go too shallow and retouch the tattoo later than to go too deep. That is a very simple rule you should keep in mind. In case you wonder why I am tattooing here without color, this is a great exercise for beginners to find the right depth. I simply made 3 stencil lines on my brother's thigh, dipped the needle in shading solution, and you can practice really well. My brother goes through a lot with me so I can make these tutorials for you, so he will get a beer for every 500 likes under this video. So if you want to thank my brother, like the video. Depending on the body area, I vary the penetration depth between 0.5 and 1 millimeter, which corresponds to approximately 0.02 to 0.04 inches. Since the skin thickness varies in different parts of the body, a simple rule of thumb applies. Thinner skin areas require a shallower penetration depth, while thicker skin areas require a deeper penetration depth. Here I show you what happens when you do not stretch the skin properly. Although I have enough color in the cartridge and the right depth, the line looks like this in the end. I tattooed this line without stretching the skin, and this line with stretching, using the same depth and same speed. It's incredible what stretching the skin does. With these small back and forth movements, I search for the right depth, approximately 0.5 millimeter. Because I rest my thumb on the other hand, I can hold the depth perfectly and pull the line flawlessly. This is how the line looks then. Absolutely solid, not too deep, simply perfect. Because you can't watch it enough, here's another line for you, and of course for my brother. For the lines, I'm using a 7-round liner needle, extending it about 4 millimeters out of the cartridge. I'm working with a 4.2 millimeter stroke and 8 volts. Now, I'll shave the area thoroughly. Apply the skin disinfectant to a paper towel, then use it to clean the skin. Next, I'll apply a thin layer of stencil solution. Place the stencil in the desired position and peel it off. Let the stencil dry for 10 minutes to avoid smudging while working. Before I start, I always apply a thin layer of Vaseline to the skin to make wiping away excess ink easier. With these small motions, I search for the correct depth and then pull the line with a steady movement. You don't have to pull the line in one go. You can stop if needed, but it's important to leave the skin gently. Dab off the excess ink. After each line, dip the needle into the ink once. Since I finished the previous line correctly, it's now easy to pick up exactly where I left off. Always remember, go in firmly and leave softly. In this close-up, you can see that I'm stretching the skin with my left hand. This is especially important to ensure a consistent depth. Every beginner's goal should be to pull a continuous line at the same speed and depth, so keep that in mind. Unfortunately, the client moved and flinched a lot during the tattooing. This can happen in practice, so it's important to know how to handle it. I try to follow the stencil and use my left hand, which is stretching the skin, to compensate for the movements. As a general rule with circles, or as in this case with a curve, try to keep the machine's angle steady. Avoid a shallow angle. Instead, use a steeper angle to place the ink perfectly in the skin, avoiding any blowout. I apply a thin layer of Vaseline to make it easier to wipe off the excess ink after tattooing. The layer needs to be thin, otherwise the fine needles could get clogged. With my free hand, I stretch the skin and try to get a feel for it. I tattoo about 0.5 millimeters deep. It is important that there is always enough ink coming out of the cartridge. Especially with thick needles, it's necessary to have a good ink flow, so I need to make sure that I frequently dip the needle into the ink. If something is wrong with the ink flow, I need to adjust the needle, either by changing the voltage or adjusting how far the needle extends from the cartridge until it's correct. However, it looks good here. I gently wipe off the excess ink to preserve the stencil. I pull the machine towards me for almost all the lines I make and try to ensure that the needle is drawn parallel to the stencil. In this setting, you can clearly see the angle at which I hold the machine. If the angle is wrong, it's almost impossible to make a clean line. Now let's move on to the long, thick lines. This is probably the most challenging part for beginners. But don't worry, I'll show you how it works. I stabilize my guiding hand with my free thumb and don't try to draw the line all at once. I stay relaxed and can stop at any time. To avoid a visible transition, I leave the skin very gently. Carefully wipe off the ink. Apply some Vaseline and continue. When drawing long lines, it doesn't matter how often you stop and start again, as long as you follow the mentioned steps. It's also important to ensure that the two thick lines have a sufficient distance between them so that over the years, as the tattoo changes, they don't blend into one thick line. Therefore, always maintain enough space between the lines. This is the finished tattoo, and I'm very satisfied with it. I work here with 8 volts, but you have to be careful because this can vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. You need to figure out what voltage works best for you. I'm filming so you can see it very well with a macro lens with double magnification. The tattoo looks huge in the picture, but it's only about 3 centimeters wide, and with this lens, every little mistake is immediately visible. But I gladly accept this pressure to give you the best possible insight into what I'm doing. I position the hand holding the tattoo machine on my thumb of the free hand and draw the lines towards me, which has the advantage of being much more stable than if you don't support your hand, for example. Here you can perfectly see that I work systematically. I have positioned myself so that I can now do all the horizontal lines. I'll do the rest later, but for that, I need to change my position. Now I sit on this side, and as you can see, I draw the lines towards me. These 2 to 3 small movements when starting the lines I do because I can find the depth with them and make sure enough ink comes out of the cartridge. Because we're filming with a macro lens, it looks very easy in the video. However, anyone who has ever held a tattoo machine knows that you can hardly see the needle, which is why I take a lot of time to hit the stencil exactly when starting each line. Although I constantly wipe over the stencil, it is still super visible. The reason for this is that we let it dry for 10 minutes. For the next lines, I change my position again so that I can draw the lines towards me. In this camera setting, you can wonderfully see how I stretch the skin with my free hand so I can work smoothly with my machine. I always try to follow the stencil exactly. If you are a beginner, I would recommend not doing this tattoo on real skin, but on fake skin. In my view, it's a great design for beginners because you can see every mistake immediately, which helps you improve. The client's positioning is also important. I would never tattoo such a design in a sitting position because the client can move too much. I dip the needle into the ink after each line to always have a good ink flow. It would be frustrating if you draw the perfect line and then there is not enough ink in the cartridge. I always try to draw my lines continuously, but now I'll show you what to do if it's not possible and you have to lift the needle. I try to exit the skin with the needle as gently as possible, and when continuing the line, re-enter the skin gently, so there should be no visible transition. It's always better to lift and re-enter multiple times than to have a messy line. Before we move on to the next step, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel and leave a like. Thanks for the support. With the first packing technique, I make small circular movements and first see how the client's skin reacts, and if it absorbs the color properly. If something isn't right, I need to either adjust the needle or change the voltage. Here, however, everything worked perfectly right away. With this technique, I first fill in the area towards the edge. The advantage is that I don't have to focus on both sides at once, only on one side, which could be particularly good for beginners. In the second pass, I do the same on the other side, but it's important that the areas overlap in the middle to avoid any bald spots. With the second packing technique, which is the one I mainly use, I make even circular movements and work directly on both sides up to the edges. This has the advantage of being twice as fast. With this technique, it's also important not to make the circular movements too quickly to ensure enough color gets into the skin. In my opinion, this technique is more suitable for advanced users, but beginners can also practice it on fake skin. With the next packing technique, I make small zigzag movements. You can imagine it as making many small lines next to each other. This method can be used, for example, if you are not comfortable with small circular movements, then this would be a great alternative. Since this is a small area, I can let the needle stick out further from the cartridge, and there is still enough ink coming out. The next technique is very similar to the very first technique, but here I make very small circular movements and can therefore move the needle faster. The reason I show you this is that the smaller the circles, the faster you can move forward. Logically, the larger the circles, the slower you move. This applies to all needles. In the middle, there is still a small bald spot, so we need to make 3 passes with this technique. Here you can see how small the tattoo looks to the human eye. The client was very satisfied. Today, I'll show you how I tattoo this spider design on real skin. First, I thoroughly shave the area where the design will be placed. Next, I clean the area with skin disinfectant. Now I apply a thin layer of stencil stuff and spread it evenly. I place the stencil just as the client requested. Peel it off, and we're ready to go. To fill in the solid areas, I use a 9 soft edge Magnum needle. The voltage remains the same, but I switch the stroke to 3.9 millimeters. Even with the packing technique, it's important to always stretch the skin well. When I want to fill an area, I try to move the needle very quickly, so that as many different skin spots as possible are hit by the needle. 8 volts is fast, so I can also move my machine very fast. Beginners, however, can set a lower voltage and work more slowly. It takes some practice to work right up to the edges with a Magnum needle. If you can't manage it right away, it's better to use a smaller needle to work the edges. For example, a liner or round shader needle. If you don't succeed at working the edges the first time, don't try again. Otherwise, you might damage the skin if you go over it too many times. Because of the ink that drips onto the skin, it's not always easy to see exactly where you're tattooing, so it's completely normal if this is difficult for you at first. The best way to practice is on fake skin. Start with small Magnum needles and try to work along the edges. Once you manage that, you can gradually move on to using larger needles. The wider the needle, the more difficult it gets. Why is it easier to fill small areas? When filling large areas, you automatically tend to work faster. For example, if you have to fill a large space, it feels, at least to me, like driving 10 miles per hour on the highway. The only way to still achieve a solid, well-filled area is patience. Many artists who paint large pictures cover the whole canvas except for the small section they're currently working on. The only reason for this is to avoid losing focus. Right now, I'm working my way around the entire area that needs to be filled. That way, I'll have a smaller space left in the center, which is easier to fill in. As you know, I always explain things in a beginner-friendly way. So now we're switching to pen and paper. This axis moves slowly, and this one moves quickly. If you can remember this tip, you've understood the concept of packing. Only 20% of the people watching are actually subscribed, so if you want to support me, hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. I'd really appreciate it. And if you keep practicing on fake skin, you'll be able to apply it in real life too. This is a relatively difficult part of the body to tattoo, and yet it works, if you work correctly. On other areas of the body, it would be even easier. In this video, I will show you 7 different shading techniques on real skin. The first technique I'll be covering is the push whip shading technique. I work here with 8 volts and a stroke of 3.3 millimeters. I am using a 9 Magnum soft edge needle. The needle extends 2 millimeters out of the cartridge. Now, let's move on to the technique. In my free hand, I hold a piece of paper towel and spray green soap on it so I can wipe away the excess ink later. Additionally, I use the rest of my free fingers to stretch the skin. The needle enters the skin vertically, and by adjusting the depth of the needle with hand movement, a gradient is created. This technique is great for working away from edges, but it can be challenging to create long, solid gradients. For beginners, combining this technique with a simpler design would be perfect. as it's easy to learn and can produce beautiful tattoos. As you can see, I've achieved a nice shading effect using only black ink, with the shading resulting from the depth of the needle. In practice, I've used this technique, for example, in the area shown in this tattoo. Now, let's address a common mistake to avoid. If you don't smoothly pull the needle out of the skin, you won't achieve a soft gradient, resulting in less satisfactory shading. Next, let's talk about the stipple, pepper whip shading technique, or whatever you want to call it. Now, I am working with a 4.2 millimeter stroke and 5.5 volts. For this technique, I use a 7-round liner needle and let it extend 3 millimeters out of the cartridge. Stippling shading involves inserting the needle into the skin and rotating the hand away from the needle's entry point on a rounded axis. You're doing it correctly if the needle can't enter the skin fast enough to make a solid line. Stippling occurs due to the fast hand movement. With decreased saturation, the further along an axis the hand rotates. Of course, you can also use a pulling motion for this technique as long as the voltage is low and the hand movement is fast. I've tattooed this design, for example, using this technique. Using too high a voltage with this technique doesn't yield the desired result, as you can see here. For the scumbling shading technique, I use a soft edge Magnum needle again, letting it extend about 2 millimeters out of the cartridge, and use 8 volts again. I set the stroke to 3.3 millimeters. With this technique, I make small circular motions, adjusting the depth of the needle with my hand movement to create shading. The slower the circular motions, the more solidly the ink is incorporated into the skin. Since I only want a light shading, I rotate the circular motions a bit faster. The texture created with this technique depends on the size of the circles and the pressure applied to the needle. This technique I often use in practice for dark backgrounds, such as in this tattoo at this particular spot. It's crucial to use a Magnum needle with rounded corners for this technique. Otherwise, visible edges may appear in the shading, as you can see here. Now onto the pull whip shading technique. The settings remain the same as in the previous technique. Unlike the push whip shading, I don't push the needle away from me, but instead pull it towards me. A significant advantage of this technique is that it's less aggressive on the skin. Whenever you pull a needle, it's less aggressive on the skin compared to pushing it away, which can result in less skin trauma. It's not just with this technique. Generally, a larger Magnum needle yields a softer shading. In my opinion, this technique is perfect for creating light shading, like in this area of this tattoo of the King of Rock and Roll. Let's address another mistake to avoid. If you start too slowly and don't maintain a consistent movement, it can lead to a black spot where you initially started. For the dot work shading technique, I again use a 7-round liner needle, let it extend about 4 millimeters out of the cartridge, and work with 8 volts and a 4.2 millimeter stroke. Here, I attempt to create shading from bottom to top with small dots. The shading is determined by the distance between the dots and the depth to which the needle is inserted into the skin. Generally, this technique is straightforward to learn and thus perfect for beginners. There are some differences between fake skin and real skin that I will now explain to you. In my opinion, the most important thing with real skin is that it needs to be stretched very well so that the ink is absorbed evenly. Another important point is that on real skin, the ink mixes with blood, making everything look much darker when fresh. However, this changes once the tattoo heals, so as beginners, don't be discouraged if your tattoos look too dark right after you finish them. If you trust your technique and follow simple rules, you'll quickly get a feel for it. I tattooed this design, for example, using this technique. If you go too deep, it can result in a blowout, which may not be immediately visible after tattooing, but becomes apparent once the tattoo has healed. You can see the principle illustrated nicely on paper here, showing what happens when you linger too long in the skin. This is cross shading. Here you can see the machine and needle settings. With this technique, I shade in two different directions. To make it less aggressive on the skin, I also pull the needle towards me. In my opinion, you can achieve a really cool effect with this technique. If you want to add some texture to the shading, this technique is very well suited. With the many lines close to each other, it looks like a very fine net, and over the years, it will get softer and softer. This technique could also be done with a liner needle to create the cross-hatching effect, as you can see beautifully illustrated in this picture. Here, I use this technique. You can also create very soft shading with it. Now, let's talk about a mistake to avoid. It's important to keep the needle parallel to the skin. Otherwise, you'll get uneven shading, as you can see here. The best part comes at the end. Pendulum shading. Again, you can see my machine settings here. With this technique, I do the majority of my shading. This is how I hold the machine and move it evenly back and forth. I love this technique because it yields a soft shading in every direction, allowing for long, continuous shading. Even with round liner needles, you can tattoo this method excellently to create fine, detailed shading. In this design, I mainly applied pendulum shading. Unlike here, you should try to make controlled movements so that it results in a solid shading in the end. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate it if you give it a like and subscribe to my channel to support me. In this video, I will show you how I tattoo a long continuous shading with this Greywash. I was determined to make this video, so I convinced my brother to let me tattoo a shaded bar on his thigh just to show you how it works.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
For this shading, I'm using a 3.3mm stroke and working with 8 volts. I set the needle so that it extends approximately 2mm from the cartridge. Let's move on to the technique. I start with pure black. I apply a thin layer of Vaseline so that I can wipe off the excess ink more easily later. I begin with the whip shading technique and try to create a very dark area with a gradient outward. Unlike the packing technique, for shading, multiple continuous passes are necessary, but don't worry, if you do it just like I do, no unwanted skin damage can occur. I'll also show the healed tattoo later in the video, and you'll see that it has healed perfectly. I would recommend buying some fake skin and just trying it out. On fake skin, more passes are probably necessary because it doesn't take the ink as well, but it's perfect for practice. With small circular motions, I fill in the little gap at the edge. Since I have a lot of experience, I work with the soft edge needle directly along the edges. Beginners can also use a round shader or round liner needle for the edges. It's much easier to work precisely with smaller needles. It's important when you work from dark to light to rinse the needle with distilled water in the next step. I mix the next shade of gray directly in the cartridge. The advantage of this is that even though I only have 4 ink caps, I can create 7 shades of gray. Here, I am using the pendulum shading technique. It's my absolute favorite technique because it allows me to create super smooth gradients in all directions. Another pass is necessary here. By the way, I'm using a 23 Magnum soft edge needle here, but you can also use a 15 or 17 needle. Apply a thin layer of Vaseline again. Once again, I'm using the pendulum shading technique and creating the next shade of gray. Many people have asked in the comments how much pressure they should apply when pressing the machine onto the skin. Since this is a matter of feeling, it's hard to explain, but I'll try. Make sure to apply only minimal pressure, especially on sensitive skin. Too much pressure can cause the shading to appear blotchy. It might sound a bit strange, but I believe that if you watch closely, you can roughly get a sense of how much pressure I'm using. Now I'm mixing the midtone directly in the cartridge again. Since we're now working with very light shades, I'm switching the technique from pendulum to the pull whip shading technique. It's perfect for very light shading. A great thing about this technique is that it's very gentle on the skin because the needle is being pulled. It makes a big difference whether the needle is pulled or pushed. In this case, the needle glides much more smoothly over the skin, making it much easier to create a light shade. Although I need several passes to get the color into the skin, we end up with a perfect shade. Now I'm using the second lightest gray tone. As always, I apply some Vaseline and stretch the skin. When tattooing, especially when shading, it's crucial to keep the skin taut by pulling it in the opposite direction with your free hand. This ensures an even distribution of pigment and prevents the needle from bouncing or creating uneven shadows. So you'll notice that the better the skin is stretched, the better it takes the color. Light shading requires time and a lot of passion. I'm working especially carefully here because areas that are too dark cannot be undone. Once again, I'm mixing the ink directly in the cartridge, which in my opinion works perfectly. It's also possible to mix even more shades of gray, but I don't think that's necessary. Even though we're already using the second lightest gray, the shading still appears slightly darker than it will once healed. This is because the skin is open and bleeding slightly during the tattooing process, which makes a fresh tattoo appear darker overall. However, since I know exactly which gray tone I'm using, I'm not worried about it. As you know, I always work systematically. The tattoo is meant to look perfect once healed, so I intentionally tattoo a bit darker. At least it looks that way right after it's done. The less we leave to chance, the more precise the final result will be. Now, let's move on to the lightest shading. There's no change in technique here, but you can see that the lighter the gray, the more visible the blood becomes. You shouldn't let that distract you though, because different parts of the body vary in sensitivity, and some clients bleed more than others. Normally, the redness of the tattoo fades quickly. Most tattoos look quite different just 20 minutes later. Now you know how to tattoo a long, continuous gradient. This is the tattoo after 2 weeks. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe and check out my other tutorials. And if you want to take your shading to the next level, make sure to check out my online tattoo shading course